guys. Well, it's great to be back with you all this morning. I wasn't really expecting to be back here until maybe the early part of next year sometime. But when Mark called me, the first thing I said was, yeah, you bet. I'll be glad to come back. What was interesting was when I got to thinking about what I'd be doing, the first thing that came to my mind, since Christmas is right around the corner, is that we would be talking about Christmas in some way or another. And I got to looking at the Advent calendar and saw that this week was peace. So when I asked Mark, I said, well, you know, what did you have in mind? And he said, well, we've been talking about world religions. We've been doing a series on them, and this is like right in the middle of that series. And I thought, oh. And so then when I sort of listened inside, and when I thought this week was for peace, what world religion should I talk about? And the only answer I got was Islam. So what I'd like to do is share with you guys a few things about the Islamic faith, and so we'll all have a better understanding of our Muslim brothers and sisters, and talk a little bit about what peace means to folks in Islam. So when we ask ourselves, okay, how did it begin? What does being Muslim mean? What is Islam? Islam began in the early part of the 7th century, around what is currently Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And it began in an area which at the time was mostly polytheistic in religion. And I'll talk about how many gods they were worshiping a little later, but it was very different from what we understand now, and certainly different than those Abrahamic religions that I was talking with the kids about, like Judaism and Christianity, which believe in essentially one God. So there's this fellow named Muhammad, and I will just add that if I were a devout Muslim, I would now invoke a blessing upon his name. Anytime a Muslim says the name of the Prophet Muhammad, they add a blessing from God to Muhammad. But this fellow named Muhammad, who had been a merchant, got to take it easier in life. He was in his late 30s, 40s, and he married a wealthy woman. And so he began spending more and more time in contemplation. And what he would do is go up to a mountain that was near Mecca called Mount Hira, and he would spend time in meditation and prayer. And one day around the end of 609 or 610 of the Common Era, he heard the Arabic word, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, which means recite. And he paused and said, recite what? And words began coming to him. So as he began reciting these words aloud, what they told him about was they told him about a faith of one God and not many gods. Of course, this was very different from the faith of most of the people around him. But as time went on, more and more people began listening to these things that Muhammad was reciting, these messages he was receiving, and the faith began to grow. I'm going to leave out a lot of the details of what happened, but at a certain point, he led a group of those people from Mecca to another place, which was Yathrib. I'm guessing that's how you say it. And that was called the Hijra. And at that point, and that was around 622 of our Common Era, that's when the Muslim calendar begins. So if you ever wonder, how they calculate the Muslim calendar, there's two things. Number one, it begins around 622 of our time, but it's a lunar calendar, so the years don't coincide exactly with the solar calendar that we use. So, what does Islam mean? What does the word mean? Now, I have often heard people say that Islam means peace. That's not necessarily so. For a lot of folks, the traditional translation of Islam from Arabic means submission, which in a way, if we think of submission as being acceptance, and then we go a step further into unity speak and say divine order, well, that's a lot like peace. But what they might really say it is entering into the condition of peace and security with God through allegiance and surrender to Him, which again to me sounds like kind of a long way of saying divine order. So, not that different from us. So, a couple other things about Islam. They come from the tradition of Abraham, and they have the belief that we are all part of one big family. So, as Muhammad began putting forward these prophecies, which eventually became the Quran, one of the things we find in there is that they honor the earlier prophets. And in Islam, they refer to Jesus as Isa, but he is named as not only a prophet, but also as the Messiah of the Jewish people, and even honors Moses as Mosa, so that the Old Testament and the New Testament writings are both honored as part of the Muslim faith. They kind of trace their heritage back through. And the idea, though, is that the collected writings of what we consider the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures over time had become corrupted's a strong word, I guess. Maybe mistranslated, or like we didn't get it all down. And if you know anything about Bible, about how the Bible was formed, it was kind of pulled together from scraps and pieces of oral tradition. So what the Muslims believe is that Muhammad basically got like straight dictation from God, got the whole prophecy all at one time, and he's supposed to be like the last prophet. So that we're kind of all included in the same family, but that the Quran is basically the straight out Word of God. In fact, they believe that it was transmitted from a book that has existed since the beginning of time called the Mother of Books. And again, there's an Arabic phrase for that I'm not going to try to get. So, Islam is based on the Quran, and the Quran was written by Muhammad from that time when he first came out of the cave in late 609 or early 610, all the way up until his death in 632. He would periodically transmit some of these prophecies. The people who were with him would scribe them, and then after his death, they collected them all together, came up with one absolute, this is the copy, down to the way that the accents were placed on the syllables. And then they sent 5 copies of that out to the main centers that had developed at that point. So the Quran becomes the non-negotiable authority for life as a Muslim. That's a little bit different from the Bible, which we interpret a whole lot of different ways. We interpret it metaphysically, metaphorically, allegorically. We even have a few friends that try to interpret it literally. But that kind of wiggle room, that we take with the Bible is not really there for Muslims. Now, what develops from this is there's the Quran, which is the Word of God. There is then a collection of writings that were recorded shortly after the death of Muhammad, which are collectively referred to as the Hadith. And they are basically examples of how Muhammad lived. So for us, that would be like some of the stories in the New Testament of what Jesus did. It's like a little different from, there's the sayings or the teachings of Jesus, and then we also have some of, what what we think or what people recorded that he did. So they sort of put a difference in there. Okay, here's what God said through Muhammad, and then here's how Muhammad lived. Here's how he outpictured it. So they have those volumes that they work from, and they do that mostly allegorically, or they draw analogies from his life. And then the final piece of their liturgy is something that you all are probably familiar with, and that is the Sharia, or the Sharia, however you pronounce it. But that is Islamic law. And that is law codes for life, and it's basically how you go about everyday living. And one thing that I found that it's real neat is that the idiomatic interpretation of it is a well-worn path that camels take to the watering place. So it's how we walk, every day, day in and day out, back and forth, that well-worn path. Now, as we know, Christianity kind of divided as soon as basically as soon as Jesus was gone. There were a lot of different kinds of groups of Christians, and many of them kind of died out in the first couple of hundred years. The Catholic Church sort of took over from that point, from around the year 300, basically until the Reformation, and Martin Luther nailed his thesis to the door, and Protestantism formed. In Islam, they actually splintered off fairly early. After the Prophet died, there was not any clear delineation as to who was supposed to be the next guy in charge. Well, what a bunch of people thought was, well, let's make the guy that's the most qualified. We're going to make him the guy, and that was a fellow named Abu Bakr. So he became the Caliph. Well, there were some folks that were related to Muhammad that didn't like that so much, and they thought that his closest relative, who was a guy named Ali, should have become the Caliph. The folks who supported the guy that was the Caliph, Abu Bakr, became the Sunni Muslims. And the party of Ali became the Shia, party of Ali, Muslims. And we've all heard in the news, okay, these are Sunni Muslims and these are Shia, and maybe they're fighting over this, or whoever's in charge currently in Iraq, and that's where they come from. So historically, the Sunni have been more into a more secular version of Islam, where you might have a constitutional monarchy, or even something that kind of resembles a representative democracy, like the Yurgas we see in Afghanistan, where it's a town council sort of gets together and decides who's going to be the guy in charge. The Shia, on the other hand, have gone with a series of imams, or holy men, and so they're a little more theocratically arranged in terms of their politics. There had been a series of caliphs and caliphates that essentially made Islam not only a religion, but a political system. The last caliphate was disbanded in Turkey in 1924. So I won't even get into that whole series, because I could talk about that for days and days. But basically, the main two parties, or the two pieces of Islam that we hear about, are Sunni and Shia. Now, there's a third piece, or a third version of Muslims that I'll talk a little bit more about later, and those are the Sufis. And they came along a little bit later, but they sort of have their own special deal going on, and I want to spend a little more time on them. Now, the key thing that differentiated Muslims from the people around them at the time was their belief in one God. And it was a radical departure from the world that they lived in at the time. That area of Arabia was extremely polytheistic. I mean, to the point of having just about one God for every day of the year. So what what Muhammad heard in that cave is, kind of like what Moses heard on the mountain, I am. That there is only one God. And in fact, Allah, which is the Arabic word for God, it literally means either the God or the one who is God. So theirs is an absolute monotheism. And, obviously by monotheistic we mean one God. Of course, many Christians consider Christianity to be monotheistic, even though in a lot of the traditional Christian religions, well, actually God's sort of like three people. He's God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Muslims aren't buying into that. There's only one. God is singular. So there's also a piece of that makes God separate. And in that, we sort of disagree with them a little bit. The God of Islam is traditionally completely monotheistic, as opposed to being monistic, which many of us in Unity kind of tend towards monism. And I'm kind of skipping ahead from some stuff, but monism is a point of view within metaphysics which argues that the variety of existing things in the universe are reducible to one substance or reality, and therefore that the fundamental character of the universe is unity. Make sense? So monism is a form of monotheism, but it says that basically we're all one and includes God in that. The monotheism of Islam says no, you don't get to be God, but there's only one God. So Islam is basically founded on what are called the 5 pillars of Islam, and that belief, that specific belief in the singularity of God, is the first pillar, which is called Shahada, if I'm saying it correctly. And Shahada is the belief that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. You may have heard that in some form or another somewhere else. The second of their 5 pillars is the daily prayers that they perform in the direction of the Kaaba, which is the shrine at Mecca. Now, what's interesting about the Kaaba is that it's built on a site that was believed to have been a sanctuary for Adam and was a shrine constructed by Abraham and his son Ishmael, who was the father of the Arabs back in prehistory. Now, at the time when Muhammad and some of the early Muslims returned to Mecca, remember they'd gone off to that other place, and that was the beginning of the Muslim calendar. They came back and claimed Mecca. When they did that, they took the 360 shrines to the 360 gods that were in the Kaaba, and they rededicated that shrine to the one true God. So if you've ever seen pictures of a Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, and you see that big black shrine, that's the shrine that Muhammad reclaimed for the one God from the 360 gods back in the early 7th century. So that's the direction that Muslims pray when they do their daily prayers 5 times a day. It's interesting. I worked with a lot of Muslims when I was in the Middle East. And I remember one day I was in one of the latrines, and I saw one of the workers was washing his feet in the sink. And I mean, it's really hot and dusty out there, and I just kind of thought, okay, can't you cool off some other way? And then I found out later on what he was actually doing was getting ready for prayer. The tradition is before you get onto your prayer mat, you clean basically the parts of your body that are exposed to the elements. So, for men, it would most likely be their lower arms and feet and their faces. So he was just getting ready for prayer. So the third pillar of Islam is the daily fast during the month of Ramadan, which I mentioned. And that also works on a lunar calendar, so that the dates of Ramadan change every year. It's been getting earlier and earlier. Now, at the end of Ramadan, there is the Feast of Eid, which is it's kind of like Mardi Gras in reverse. You know, in New Orleans, they always have Fat Tuesday right before they, give up stuff for Lent. Well, Eid is at the end of Ramadan. And one of the things that they will traditionally do is give zakat, which is the fourth pillar of Islam, and that is almsgiving to the poor. So you give to poor and charitable causes, and it's usually 1/40 of your income, which works out to 2.5%. The fifth pilgrim of Islam is that Hajj, that pilgrimage to Mecca once in your lifetime, if you're able to do it. So we see the, kind of how it's all integrated, the one God, prayer, fasting, and that sense of joining with those who have less than we have, giving back some to those who have less than we have, and finally really going and seeing, where it came from, where it all began. One of the things that we hear a lot about in the West when we think of Islam is jihad. And it's interesting, we think of jihad as being defined by the words holy war. But what jihad is really from the Arabic for jahada, which means he made an effort. And there are really two forms of jihad. The lesser jihad is the one that we think of, which takes place in the external world, and it is for fighting in defense of Muslims. And there are some very specific rules from the Quran about how that's supposed to be done. Not killing women, children, or old men, not even harming trees, not taking the livestock of the enemy except for food, and leaving people who are monks alone. So they're very, very specific and very, very ordered. But the real jihad, the greater jihad, is the fulfillment of a personal goal, the overcoming of wrongdoing within oneself. It's that inner struggle. And when I think about some of the work that we do, some of the work that I personally do, I have to admit that I think of it as a struggle sometimes, overcoming some of the issues that I have, that I've faced. It is kind of like a holy war going on inside. So it's not that far away from some of the things that we do. Now, when we think about what does it mean to live as a Muslim and live in peace, I pulled some things out of the Quran that I wanted to share with you, or from a few other places. For example, in his last sermon, the Prophet Muhammad told his believers, "Hurt no one, so that no one may hurt you." What I hear in that is Luke 6:31, "Do to others as you would have them do to you." Now, there was an Islamic scholar who did a lot of translation of Muhammad's writings or the things that he said back in the early 20th century. His name was Jeffrey Waddles. And he holds that Muhammad's compassion appears in several of these statements that have been attributed to him. "Woe to those who, when they have to receive by measure from men, exact full measure, but when they have to give by measure or weight to men, give less than due." And again in that I heard Luke 6:38, "Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back." Now this takes us back to the story I told the children. The Quran commends, none of you truly believes until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. Seek for mankind that of which you are desirous for yourself, that you may be a believer. Treat well as a neighbor the one who lives near you, that you may be a Muslim. And it has in parentheses what Muslim means, one who submits to God. That which you want for yourself, seek for mankind. The most righteous of men is the one who is glad that men should have what is pleasing to himself, and who dislikes for them what is for him disagreeable. And again in that I could hear Mark 12:31. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Another thing about peace in Islam is that peacemaking and peacemakers are revered in Islam. One of the terms meaning peace and peacemaking in Arabic, sul, which is used in the Quran, is the root of the word islah, denoting development and improvement. So this term is used to refer to peacemaking. Peacemakers are agents of good, and those who breach it are elements of corruption and sin. It is therefore observed that peace and peacemaking are seen in Islamic tradition as part and parcel of human development. In Islam, peace and making peace are seen as godly acts worthy of praise and reward. In Islam, peace is advocated as a divine quality to be pursued in order to achieve the state of felicity that we were in paradise, man's former dwelling. When I read that, I think of Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. So, in Islamic thought, in the faith, the ideal society for them would be something they refer to as Dar as-Salam, literally the house of peace. And it says that Allah invites to the abode of peace and guides whom He pleases in the right path. The establishment of the abode of peace on earth means establish peace in everyday lives at all levels. This includes personal, social, state, and international levels. Does that sound like the kingdom of heaven that Jesus used to try to describe so many ways? The house of peace. And I'll just close by saying that all three of those Abrahamic faiths, all those religions, peace was central to all of them. In all of them, the way that we greeted someone was to say, peace to you, or peace be to you. It was Shalom Aleichem in Judaism, Pax Vobiscum to early Christians, and Salam Alaikum in Islam. Salam Alaikum.